The development process is really hard, especially when you're looking to make the final product perfect. During that production phase, you come across problems and new ideas, and you mix and match, and you eventually come up with your final draft. But one of the most fascinating development processes are that of video games. Many bizarre ideas and mindstormings later, they come up with the final product, which differs greatly from the original idea. Thanks to the internet, we get to know more about how games used to look like in the earlier versions, mostly betas, prototypes, and proposed ideas that were used as proof of concept. Today I'm going to talk about early versions and ideas of video games that were different from release. Saints Row Part 4 started development a few months after the release of Saints Row III. The plot would have focused on Johnny Gat being brought back to life in the form of an evil clone, and he would have brought back some of history's worst people, such as Genghis Khan, Cleopatra, and even Joseph Stalin. These evil tyrants would have been the leaders of gangs who occupied the new city, and the player would have to take them out, just like every Saints Row game before. New gameplay features would include a cover system, a parkour system, and a brand new weapon customization system with attachments. So, what happened? THQ went bankrupt and the project was cancelled, but when Deep Silver bought the rights to the game, we've got Saints Row 4, which has a different story. However, some ideas that were planned for Saints Row Part 4 are present in Saints Row 4, like that side-scrolling beat-em-up mission. Unlike Saints Row 4, which heavily reused assets from its predecessors, the game was planned to have a new look in gameplay. While both ideas are obscure, the Part 4 idea is quite an interesting take on Saints Row. I mean, at this point, Saints Row was trying to be a unique thing, something different from its competition, which was Grand Theft Auto.
Not all your enemies will be found on the battlefield.
Barbarians!
Rise Son of Rome is easily one of the best launch titles for the Xbox One and a hidden gem. But did you know it was initially meant for the Xbox 360? In the year 2006, the Project Kingdoms, which was a first-person fantasy-themed sword-fighting game, was being developed by Crytek. There was even a CryEngine 3 demo at Gamescom that looked so similar to the project. In the beginning of 2009, Phil Spencer of Microsoft took interest in the game. Through the many years of development, the project will evolve into a more realistic Roman-themed game. It had no fantasy elements as it was originally intended. The development team had envisioned Rome as a more vibrant, colorful, and majestic city at the height of its power. However, that didn't make the final cut. There were also plans to add psychological horror elements, but that was scrapped later in development. In Rise Son of Rome, the enemies at Glotzhaupt were supposed to be Minotaur-like creatures, for example. The story of Project Kingdoms was very different from the released game, with the game focusing on the General Julius Caesar and the toughest warriors he handpicked. Most of them weren't rendered into the game, but Crytek created concept profiles for the characters that you can choose for soldiers with a background for each of them. The hero of Kingdoms was not named. He was younger and less experienced than Marius, the protagonist of the Xbox One game. Little of the narrative itself had been figured out at this stage, and many characters from this version have been recovered, and they look amazing. Take a look. Also, at E3 2010, there was a live-action teaser trailer for the codename Kingdoms, shown during Microsoft's presentation at the event. It was targeted for a 2011 release at the time. The project will later face many changes, even in style of play. Rise Son of Rome almost became a Kinect title. Not long after E3, Crytek began looking into Microsoft's new upcoming Kinect hardware and drew plans to potentially implement it into Kingdoms. This one was a brawler type of game. Crytek envisioned a scenario where the player would take up arms as an unnamed gladiator, performing kicks, punches, and slashes towards the Kinect sensor to slay other soldiers. There are storyboards of the scenario circulating on the internet, which show how ambitious the project was, even for something that's not known for great titles. Microsoft took well to Crytek's ideas and decided that Kingdoms would be well suited for the Kinect. Before long, it was already being built into the game by around November 2010. Later on in development, the development team would face technical issues working on the Kinect version. The project was increasingly in jeopardy at this point, and there was growing doubt that this game is worth releasing on the Kinect, as it was for a different kind of audience. The Crytek Budapest offices had made 3 prototypes at this point: the aforementioned standard controller first-person mode, which also had minor elements of Kinect, one with solely Kinect inputs, and another with fully button-based options in third person. Ruffian Games separately have been experimenting with the fully controlled style of play. Unsatisfied with the results they were producing, it was in January 2011 that Microsoft eventually intervened and had Crytek pull the project away from the Budapest team. The project will later end up in the hands of Crytek Frankfurt, with a Kinect version in mind. But the team was questioning whether or not motion controls were suitable for this type of game. Even though they were undecided on what to do with the game, at E3 2011, a trailer for Rise was shown. It was a CG trailer and there was no actual gameplay. The Frankfurt team was working on a cinematic version of Rise in the style of Dragon Lair, but it was scrapped months into development. It featured branching paths with multiple choice dialogue trees. Crytek apparently believed it was too hard to sell for an audience expecting a product more substantial and interactive. The hero was also changed from the young soldier to a more badass looking character named Evander, who would later evolve into Marius from the actual game. Later in the year, Crytek decided it was time to finally bite the bullet and figure out for certain which version of the game to go with. The Kinect one, the first-person one, or the third-person one. A company-wide survey was conducted with many employees testing the 3 prototypes, and they had to choose their favorite. However, the team faced a dilemma. There was a near-perfect division between people who favored each. Every version had its fans. They extended the survey to Microsoft user research labs and with close relatives of the company, and the results were in favor of the third-person version. At this point, the project took a new direction, and Crytek Frankfurt started entirely from scratch with this one, this time for the console of the next generation, which was the Xbox One. Any and all plans for the long-awaited 360 version of Rise were abandoned, as the game continued its journey to release. A lot has changed from the initial idea, but at the end, it paid off. We got the hidden gem that was Rise, rather than a Kinect title that would probably have a dance-off minigame.
We've been expecting you. Welcome to Bullworth Academy.
This Rockstar classic was subjected to many changes due to controversial features. When Bully was first announced, Jimmy was more of a player-controlled anti-hero who would bully and torture the students at Bullworth Academy, as seen in the promotional images for the game. This however changed in the final cut, with Jimmy actually being more of an upstanding character, as Rockstar felt that their initial idea of Jimmy was too edgy. Not only that, but the principal of the academy, Dr. Crabblesnitch, was supposed to be more cruel and was the main villain of the game, but that role ultimately went to Gary Smith. The developers went for a more photorealistic vibe, and thus these ideas were scrapped as well. Some of the crude assets of the game remain in the final cut, like the bust of Dr. Crabblesnitch, which is more like the beta model of him. The beta version of Dr. Crabblesnitch looks more hideous and villainous compared to the Crabblesnitch we got in the final game. Pretty much all of the characters in the beta version looked far different from the ones in the final product, and they all had a more cartoony look to them. There was also a clique that was cut in the game who were a bunch of punks led by Russell, but they were eventually replaced by the Bullies clique in the final cut. The prefects were originally going to carry batons, but later this was downgraded to paddles, and it got scrapped later on in development. Speaking of paddles, there was a cut mission from Chapter 4 that revolved around stealing Dr. Crabblesnitch's paddle and framing the jock Damon for the crime. Data pertaining to it was found in the game's data files, but majority of the cutscenes were left unfinished. However, there is a part of the introductory cutscene recovered in one of the game's promotional trailers, featuring Gary Smith mocking Jimmy and Pete.
Oh, spank me!
The boys' dorm was originally a 2-story building with more rooms and a bathroom, and would be locked during midnight, and you were forced to sneak in by entering through a window. Jimmy had the ability to bully girls in the beta, but it was later changed with them automatically breaking grapples with a knee to the groin. The Preppies had a more similar fighting style to the Greasers in the beta version. Some missions had fairly minor changes from the final cut, some got removed due to being unsuitable for the rating they were aiming for. One mission, the Collector, is not present in the original Canis Canem edit, but was later added in the Scholarship edition. A detention minigame in the beta had Jimmy cleaning graffiti around the school and the town. In an earlier version of the Dropouts boss fight mission, if you lose to Edgar, you get a cutscene where Jimmy falls into acid and dies. Edgar is supposed to be heard laughing while Jimmy is dying. This was scrapped in order to retain the T rating and to avoid the darker tone that the ending presented. For this one, I had to fact check a lot, so I'd like to give a quick shout out to SWEGTA for taking the time to provide me info regarding the original idea of Bully. He's made tons of videos on Bully and the cut content surrounding it, so definitely check his channel out if you haven't. When Valve was first formed, they settled on making their first project a horror-themed 3D action game. Valve licensed the Quake engine from ID Software. The engine was modified heavily by adding skeletal animation and direct 3D support, with one developer even stating that a good 70% of the engine code was rewritten. Valve struggled to find publishers for their first project, which was considered too ambitious, but luckily it grabbed the attention of Sierra Online, who were looking for a 3D action game running on the Quake engine. Half-Life was originally called Quiver, which was taken from the Stephen King novel The Mist. Other influences include the show Outer Limits, Doom, and Quake. The first public appearances of Beta Half-Life came in early 1997. It was a hit at the E3 event that year, where they primarily demonstrated the animation system and artificial intelligence. Before the major redesign of the game in 1998, there was an early version of Half-Life called Half-Life Alpha, which was shared on Reddit in 2013 and later sold on eBay for a whopping $709. The general plot is almost identical to the final product, but substituting the security force and scientists as the secondary antagonists instead of the HECU Marines and Black Ops forces. A major difference is that the G-Man is not present. Only 3 weapons are featured and all of them have unlimited ammo: the Glock, the MP5, and the crowbar. This suggests that most weapons weren't even scripted by this time. Maps can only be accessed via console by using the map command followed by the map file name. There are 21 maps, including the chapters named The Portal Device, The Office Warrens, The Security Complex, Alien Research Lab, Communications Center, and Reactor Lab. Gordon was originally named Ivan the Space Biker, and his design was very different from the one in the final cut. He had a full wild beard that made him look like a biker, as well as a gray-green HEV suit that resembled a spacesuit, hence given the name Ivan the Space Biker. He also had a flat-top haircut and no glasses. The developers found difficulties with level design, and in desperation, a single level was assembled, including every weapon, enemy, scripted event, and level design quirk that the designers had come up so far. This single level inspired the studio to press on with the game, and finally, in November 1998, after several delays, Half-Life was released. Half-Life's sequel, Half-Life 2, had a very interesting development process as well, but that's another story for another video. Resident Evil 4 is considered to be by far one of the greatest GameCube and PS2 games of all time and the best game of the series, period. The 4th installment in the main series also introduced entirely new gameplay mechanics as opposed to the traditional Resident Evil game at the time. Some beta versions didn't have the gameplay alteration in mind and even aimed for something far different. There are various beta versions of RE4 as the game had a troubled development cycle in the beginning. One of the earliest incarnations of Resident Evil 4 was being developed for the PS2 and was scheduled to be released in 2001. The game's director at the time, Hideki Kamiya, envisioned Resident Evil 4 as a more cool and stylish action game with a main character who was invincible and had superhuman skills as a result of biotechnology. It was also decided to drop the pre-rendered backgrounds from the previous installments and instead opted for a dynamic camera system. Due to conflicts with the writing staff, the assets from that build would later be used for the first Devil May Cry. Yes, Dante was a Resident Evil protagonist at some point in development.
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
Dante was originally called Tony, and yes, Virgil was present in this version. They were originally the twins of Umbrella's founder Oswald Spencer, and they became superhumans through the use of the G-Virus. The story would later be altered numerous times, with the game later focusing on the world of demons rather than BOWs, and eventually the game's producer, Shinji Mikami, felt it strayed away from Biohazard's survival horror roots and convinced the staff to work on the game independent of the series, thus giving birth to Devil May Cry. The gameplay of this version was pretty much the same as the one in Devil May Cry, with the exclusion of sword fighting, because it originally emphasized more on guns. Devil May Cry 1 does share some similarities with the final Resident Evil 4 version. For example, the Novista doors in RE4 are based on the Beelzebub enemies in DMC. After the Resident Evil 4 that later became Devil May Cry was scrapped, there were 3 more prototypes in development: the castle version, the hallucination version, and the zombie version. This version had Leon infiltrating Oswald Spencer's castle in Europe as a part of our larger US Stratcom assault. Coinciding with this assault is an attack by Albert Wesker's HCF on the estate, who unleashed new bacteria-sized virus into the fight. Both forces are destroyed during the attack. While Leon escapes death, he's infected by the virus. Leon was to discover the origins of Umbrella Corporation and the progenitor virus, which is the granddaddy of all viruses in the Resident Evil canon. Pre-rendered backgrounds as seen in the previous games were replaced by 3D rendered settings. A trailer for the version was shown at the Tokyo Game Show 2002, and as you can see, a major plot point shown in this trailer is Leon's infection, which would later be implemented in the final version. The hallucination version, also known as the Hookman version, is similar to the Castle version gameplay and script-wise. Writer Yasuhisa Kawamura envisioned 4 as a more realistic and scary take on the Resident Evil franchise, and it was believed that it will compete with Konami's Silent Hill in terms of atmospheric and illogical horror. Not much is known about the plot, as this version was treated more of an experiment, but it's believed that it adopted more of the Castle version's story, as one of the ideas was that the hallucinations would occur after Leon's infection. Some gameplay features from this version are also present in the release version, like the red laser sight on Leon's handgun and a similar dodge mechanic. This one also had a parry mechanic where button prompts allow players to fend off enemies. In the final version of RE4, you're required to equip a grenade in the menu, but in this version you have a dedicated button for it, which comes in handy when facing certain enemies. Speaking of the enemies, the hallucination version also has some unique ones, like the Hookman, who comes out of a painting, the armored guards, and the living dolls. This version was heavily inspired by a scene in the movie The Lost Souls. There is also an idea taken from the John Carpenter movie The Fog, where a surreal fog envelops Leon when the enemies appear, appearing as a blue haze in the game. The new gameplay features that were based on Kawamura's ideas were a major technical setback for programmers, as at this point the game used up the GameCube's entire 24 megabytes of RAM capacity. This version required much of the game script to be rewritten entirely, and it eventually got scrapped. Thankfully, the ideas from the hallucination version ultimately were pitched to Production Studio 1, and thus was created the survival horror game Haunting Ground. The armored guards from this version also appear in the final version when you play as Ashley. The zombie one pretty much speaks for itself. Little is known about the gameplay or story, and pretty much the only thing that's known is the introduction of new human enemies known as the Doublemen. Shinji Mikami was displeased with the idea to return to the zombie formula. The reason for that was the poor sales performance by Resident Evil 0 and Resident Evil 1 Remake. After 3 years of patiently waiting, Shinji Mikami had enough of the troubled development RE4 faced and finally took over directorial duties, which were previously taken by Hiroshi Shibata, who worked on the 3 scrapped RE4 versions, and then in 2005, Resident Evil 4 was released. And it was a major success for Capcom that it saved the Resident Evil franchise. Resident Evil 4's gameplay mechanics inspired other games like Gears of War and Dead Space. Resident Evil 4 was named Game of the Year at the 2005 Spike Video Game Awards and some major magazines like Nintendo Power. On a side note, Resident Evil 4 had a pre-release version which had some mild differences, like the option to use a silencer on the pistol and the TMP, a different merchant menu, and some sound effect changes. And apparently a placeholder Jill model in Ada's dress and an unused alternative costume for Ashley were discovered in the retail version. As you can see, some video games go through painful stages of development and experiment with new ideas, and developers see what fits best. Those countless days of dedication and effort they put in ultimately pays off quite well. This applies to every project, including this video. It takes a lot of time, effort, and patience to make it good for other audiences to see. Thanks for watching, and I'm Kalayan signing off.